headlines from an African perspective.
It is now 19 minutes to 10. We are still hoping to bring you two conversations that we planned for today, hoping that our guests will come through. We'll speak about the environment ahead of elections in Tanzania, particularly the opposition are calling for a boycott, and we'll also look at the killing of civilians, including several journalists, following an attack on Nasser Hospital in Gaza. For now, let's take you to this. South Africa's Vaal University of Technology convening the International Conference on Climate Resilience, Smart and Sustainable Futures Summit, which seeks to enhance a sustainable future by bridging knowledge with practical impact in an effort towards a zero carbon, waste-free and a smart future. The three-day event brings together global leaders, academics, thought leaders and, of course, innovators to address the pressing issues of climate change and sustainable development. For a look at how the summit will advance Africa's climate change conversation, spokesperson for the conference, Great Zimbabwe University's Professor David Chikodzi joins us now. Professor, very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Tsepiso, and good evening to your viewers. You are speaking to Professor Kaitano Dube from the Vaal University of Technology. I am the conference director.
I do apologize, Prof, for that miscommunication. So, Professor Dube, let's start with the conference itself. What difference it brings to the conversation? We're seeing more and more of these conversations happen with different stakeholders, cross-cutting sectors. What makes this one different?
Okay, so what makes this particular conference different is that we are trying to bring across civil society, government, private industry, and also the academia on the table. It's also a transdisciplinary conference that is not streamlined to specifically looking at scientific, but we look at the overall. So we're looking at climate change impact. We are also looking at climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and also building resilience. And we are doing this from a sustainable development goals perspective to try and understand how the world can move forward sustainably in the context of the current realities of climate change. So this is the difference because we're bringing in different players, different role players in the climate change space under one roof to have a robust engagement that is transdisciplinary in nature. Thank you.
So just last week we were speaking about the implications for labor on because of climatic changes. What is the one conversation that we're not having about climate change and sustainability in particularly policy directives?
Okay, so I think in many respects there has been a lot of some of these debates at a very higher level. But given that if you look at climate change, it does not affect, let me say, it is felt at grassroots level, it's felt at household level. It sometimes in real life, it's felt at an individual level. So I think some of these conversations has been happening, but I think that in a lot of spaces, the understanding was climate change is happening, and some people thought it's something that is going to happen, and it was always seen as a distant event that you see in actually fiction science. But we are starting to see that in many respects, what we thought is sci-fi in a lot of ways is happening in terms of our current realities. If you look at some of the extreme events that the country has been experiencing, now that you mentioned the issue of labor, we have had experiences, particularly in this country, in Northern Cape, where employees that were working at a farm level died, I think, a couple of years back because of heat stroke. And if you look at those particular events, if you look at what has been happening, for example, in Durban, there is therefore a reinvigorated energy to try and understand climate not only from just understanding climate change, extremes, but to understand what is it that society can do. What are some of the gaps that are still existing that actually inhibits us from taking concrete action that allows us to build resilience. So if you look at local level at your municipality, municipalities are starting to have conversations about how can we respond to some of the impacts of climate change. It could be a drought, it could be flooding. We are experiencing these things on a daily level, and the loss and damage that is associated with these events is increasing, which then broadens the conversation to some of the sectors that we did not initially think would be part of the conversation of climate change. Because if you think about it, a couple of years back, this used to be an environmental issue, but it's no longer an environmental issue. It's a social issue, it's an economic issue, it's a daily lived reality.
And that's the point I wanted to get to, that I mentioned the fact that there are going to be think tanks as part of the community at this summit, and academia plays a very vital role in not only helping us better understand some of these new age challenges, but are there so much new change in the sense that we have indigenous knowledge systems that tell us that our forebears understood that human behavior can have an impact on the environment and therefore the widest ecosystem, including the impact on humans. So I think it just goes to how do we better educate our communities about what they already know without framing it or using language that could often be confusing.
Okay, so definitely indigenous knowledge system does play a role, particularly if you think about in terms of climate change adaptation. So the way that we can do that is to, one, take that particular discussion to the very lowest levels, and I was indicating that if we look at some of the communities and municipalities, so we really need to take this conversation outside of the classroom, outside of the conference room, to real societies, to real communities that are affected by climate change. And this means that we do need to sit down, perhaps with our indigenous leaders. It could be our politicians. And if you look at it, if you look at South Africa having, I think, elections some time last year, and if you look at all the manifestos, there was a bit of bite in terms of climate change. And part of that particular discussion was, you could actually see that if you look at all the manifestos, there was an indication of how each political party then deals with issues of just energy transition, which is, I think, a critical debate. We have the Presidential Climate Change Commission, which is partner to this particular conference. And part of what they have been doing is to sort of take this discussion not only to be from an academic perspective, but to take it to industry, to take it to societies in a manner that is very practical and very understandable. So this is how we can actually evolve. Yesterday we had a postgraduate student symposium that was held on the banks of the Vaal River at Riverside Resort, and the conversation was with the youth to say from a youth perspective, what are some of the issues, what are the fears, what are some of the opportunities that come along with not only climate change perspective, but also from a just energy transition. So in as much as there is climate change, it also brings in some new perspective. If you look at all the whole spectrum about green jobs. So we want to be seen to be participating in this conversation, not only from a morning perspective, but from also identifying some of the opportunities that can arise. We're talking about opportunities in the tech space, where we have seen a green revolution, particularly in South Africa, with a lot of green industry in the solar, in the wind energy. Then the question is, how does a person who is staying perhaps on the coastal line of Eastern Cape come to participate in the green economy that is actually emerging. So there's a whole spectrum that we, through this conference, that we are trying to drive a certain message, but also to drive innovative ideas that brings in cut-edge knowledge to the basics and the single unit of our families and of our community.
You spoke about a just transition, which has obviously been central to a lot of the discussions, but especially from a policy framework perspective and financing mechanisms. And a big part of that has been transparency. Are we better able to manage that given the failures we have seen with various projects, undertakings in the name of sustainable development and climate change imperatives?
Okay, so some of the just energy transition, there are challenges, particularly given that. So when we speak about just energy transition, at national level, there is resonance in terms of what needs to be done. There is a clear direction in what needs to be done. But I think what then becomes a bit of muddied waters, if I can use that particular term, is when we go to the global stage, particularly at UN level, because we don't go there as a country, but we go there as a region. And sometimes our international relations come to play. So instead of championing sometimes what are supposed to be very noble policy framework that is driven by our country's needs, by our country's priorities, we then get diluted because we then also have to take in a regional perspective, and sometimes we have to read the global politics. This way it becomes challenging. Of course, there are challenges with regards to the finances, and those finances for just energy transition, in many respects, in many countries, in many spheres, do not come unconditionally, but they come with a lot of strings that are attached. And it is then our responsibility as academia, as think tanks, to identify ways of unlocking opportunities in this particular space, but also to steer the country in a manner that positions us in the front row of benefiting from this just energy transition framework and development.
All right, so let's look at some of your objectives for the summit, especially in line with Agenda 2030. Let's also first start by saying, where are we lagging behind? What are the targets that we are likely to miss? And where can we pick up speed and improve?
Okay, so that's a very difficult question, but needless to say, if we look at some of the indicators from a sustainable development goals perspective, in many of the targets that we have set for the country, we are lagging behind, and this does have a context, and part of that context is in as much as I think the country had picked momentum post 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. We were in 2020 affected by the global pandemic COVID-19, which sort of reverses some of the gains I think that have been made in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If you also look at this particular period, the past 10, 15 years have also been heightened by an increase in the number of extreme weather events that we have faced, which I think which resulted in a lot of loss and damage, and countries had to reprioritize their budget to respond to climate change. So you then see that if you look at poverty, for example, from a South African perspective, if you look at some of the indicators that will allow people to maybe reduce poverty, and also to start to see that traction coming into being. If you look at just the basic indicators, if you look at employment stats, they paint a very bleak picture that as a country, we have actually digressed in terms of achieving some of the sustainable development goals. If you look at health, we spent a lot of money investing in fighting and combating both COVID-19 on the back of also fighting AIDS pandemic, we also have witnessed, I think from an international perspective, the withdrawal of aid by USA, which meant that the government then had to reprioritize some of the so this
Okay.
this becomes a very complex issue from where we are standing, but definitely there are areas where we can make inroads, and this if you look at the issue of technology, we can lead in that particular space. If we look at the space of innovation, these are spaces where we can actually make inroads and impact as we
All
move
right.
and race towards the 2030 agenda.
All right. Let's leave it there. Professor Kaitano Dube, who is Professor of Tourism Geography at Vaal University of Technology.